Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, and welcome to this book launch, the launch of this book by Professor Waseem, Political Conflict in Pakistan. Professor Waseem needs no introduction, and everybody knows that is at LUMS and professor at LUMS after many years at the Qaid Azam University in Islamabad. And everybody knows also that is the senior most political scientist, specialist of Pakistan politics. And I'm very happy to welcome this book in the series I have started with Hearst Publisher. The third book in the series, in fact. The first one was by Maya Abu Zahab, and the second one was by Asma Faiz, also from LUMS. Thank you very much for taking the time, Professor Waseem, for presenting your book. And thank you very much also to Farzana Sheikh and Ayesha Siddiqa for being with us today as discussants, but more than that, of course, because again, I'm sure everybody knows the books that Farzana and Ayesha have published. I will mention only two of them. Farzana's last book, Making Sense of Pakistan, also published by Hearst, by the way, in 2018, is a masterpiece, another masterpiece. And Ayesha's book, Military Inc., Inside Pakistan's Military Economy, that has been updated, republished not so long ago, is equally famous for all those who pay attention to Pakistan. So we will proceed as usual by letting the author introduce the discussion. It's a very, very long book that is 569 pages long. So we are not summarize, Professor Waseem will not summarize the whole argument. He will focus on some aspects of the books for 25 minutes or so. And then we'll listen to the other panelists before opening the floor for Q&As. And you are therefore invited to ask questions by using the Q&A box. You can do it whenever you want. I'll look at the questions 30 minutes before the end of this session so that we can start a conversation. Thank you, Professor Waseem, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I started the book with the premises that underlying all politics, there is conflict, be it England, France, Germany, Italy, be it Thailand, be it India, Pakistan. The conflict can be about interests, about faiths, about ideologies, about historical rivalries among groups and whatever. There is conflict that shapes politics of a country. So I came by various approaches to conflict, mostly about the causes of conflict. And of course, then whatever happens as a result of the conflict, what I found during my research was that conflict was almost a system. You can't say that there is a particular cause and effect cycle which needs to be put at the center of my study, because conflict, particularly in a post-colonial state such as Pakistan, that interested me more and more the more I studied not only Pakistan, but also other studies in the same condition, that is getting decolonized in the 20th century, sooner or later. Then I found that this conflict was very much lying between the institutional design of the state and the political practice at large. There were normative rules and there were pragmatic rules, so to say. And most of the politicians, most of the time, and most of the stakeholders outside the formal political system, they were all engaged in pursuing their interests and identities, looking in them effectiveness, not whether they were according to the constitution or not. So this gap I saw everywhere. Maybe it's the judiciary or the bureaucracy or various other institutions or local politics where the landed elite and the tribal elite operated in a certain way, while those who were there at the bottom, they were caught up in a kind of circle of votes and courts. That is, the decisions taken by the court were often influenced by those outside the court, particularly those who were competitors for vote in the public at large, and therefore they were the ones who tried to play the agency in terms of electoral politics. So conflict somewhere there in the gap between the norm and the practice. And then, of course, the fact that 30, 40, 50, 60 countries among the post-colonial states, they were busy in nation building. Their project was very much based on getting together all those who then became part and parcel of the national state at the time of independence, or before or after. Here, I saw that there was incessant cultivation of unity as the most superior norm. So, in fact, it was most divisive in the end, because religious and sectarian and ethnic divisions gained momentum because of this one-sided approach to the cult of unity. And there again, I picked up this idea that religion in this exercise became a contested territory, again a source of conflict. And here, if all these conflicts at the national level, provincial level, and the local level, if these were going on, and for the last 3/4 of a century, this has been the scene in Pakistan, then the state would have been much weaker, much more non-functioning. It would have fallen apart. What's keeping it the way it is? This was the question which I asked, because conflicts are all around. Why is the polity itself maintaining its momentum and its identity and as a mechanism of rule? So here I saw that the subaltern classes, the kind of conflict which would have mobilized them against the powerful groups and the state itself, that was actually not present. At the bottom, patronage politics kept these unhappy and poor and destitute people in check. The district was a great invention of the colonial government. Here it was that the state, along with its local bureaucracy at one end, and the powerful elements especially from the landed elite on the other, they were in constant contact. They obliged each other in preservation of the interests of each other. And that is how the class in itself, in Marxist terms, would not become the class for itself. It helped that the cultural practices of these people were not only allowed to go on. In fact, the state system, particularly the district courts, would go ahead and mollify those who are on the wrong side. And that's how I found that there is a mechanism, if not of conflict resolution, at least of maintaining the system from collapsing. There is the framework, both the formal one, that is the state, and the informal power framework in the locality. There, the status quo powers were deeply dug in. And overall, in the society, in cultural and sociological terms, what was happening? The conflict, which has been there for hundreds of years, but now it came out openly. The conflict between the cognitive self, the personality of the group and the nation, the 1001 morals and manners, the superstitions, the belief systems, whatever, the medical practices, and so on. These were there. That made the cognitive self. On the other hand, there was this new national identity, Pakistan, and entity and identity. Here we have. So the 2000-old Indian civilizational practices and beliefs on the one hand, and on the other, the new commitments to a new formal entity out there that became and has been a major source of conflict in various ways, and I have explained it throughout my book. So here we are, the way I understood and elaborated on the idea of conflict. Now, in the beginning, whatever happened by way of communication between the stakeholders on top, I will not go into detail. Partition had its impact. There was a successor state and a seceding state, although these two terms and their application to the phenomenon of partition itself has been part of controversy. But what I'm saying is this, that partition has played a great role, much greater in Pakistan than in India, because the migrants themselves, there were 20 times more in what is West Pakistan today than they were in India, and they had to have an impact. And of course, Farzana would probably talk about the migrant state that I developed as a model to explain the behavior, particularly the non-electoral behavior in Pakistan. Similarly, I've quoted, for example, from Edward Said, that nations are narrations. Whatever they develop as a narrative that then shows the ambitions of the nation, the interpretation of the past and the agenda for the future, what kind of speech, the discourse they develop, and that is rather important as far as the self-exposure of the nation is concerned, and Pakistan I have discussed in this chapter quite a bit. Some find it rather not very new, but I tried to develop this idea in the next chapter, which is the middle class. Middle class has been touched in recent years, studied, discussed as a non-progressive force. The first 50 years, the literature on Pakistan brought out mostly the progressive idea of the middle class. The middle class is modern, the middle class is globalist, the middle class is liberal as far as its interpretation and understanding of religion is concerned, as compared to the masses at large, and so on. And of course, there started emerging this critical view of the middle class in terms of not allowing space for democracy in the country, which was contradictory in terms as far as people's understanding of this particular class was concerned. And of course, I then tried to look at the two power system, middle class and the political class. Of course, political class has been studied in so many ways, but the middle class was in a way, in my work, elevated to the power center itself. And that I tried to explain with reference to the failures of the establishment to capture the dynamics of the political system and looking at it in a framework which was, we didn't fit in the democratic norms and behavior. And here, then I developed the idea of establishmentarian democracy. And of course, I started with the comparison between India and Pakistan, and then the two major forces which were formally non-political, the military and the judiciary, and how did they play their role in giving this particular direction to the national policy and profile. Now, thank you, Christoph, you talked about constitutional dynamics yesterday. Thank you for your compliment. Yeah, here I've made a critique of the way federalism has been operative, which has been considered disintegrative in nature. This is the view of the ruling elite in essence, and that's why nothing, even the 18th Amendment, nothing has really gone ahead and redistributed power. I shouldn't say the legislative subjects, which the 18th Amendment did, and to some positive results, but otherwise, no. And of course, creation of a parallel judicial system, federal Sharia court, I have discussed it. It's Justice Kakao, for example, filed a petition that the whole system is un-Islamic. So from president down to so many other public office holders, were all non-Muslims and they should go and whatever. And this is a man from the state system itself, that is the judiciary. And in the end, I said, no, religion, yes, but this in the end is a religious subsystem which continues to operate on the side of the major system itself. Mass public, I moved away from the state and I started talking about mass public. There I wanted to look at the new publicness, and I felt that that new publicness was yet to be born. The three aspects that I touched: civil society on the one hand, education on the other, and thirdly, of course, media. In all these three uh, parts of my framework, I feel that the role of civil society and the education was lacking and lagging behind certain other more active sections of the society, in as much as uh, it was controlled by uh, the state itself. So here is civil society, and I followed the pattern of control, the constraint, particularly around the NGOs and, of course, the so-called indigenous uh, associations and groups, which have been termed as civil society on the side, though they remain underdeveloped, and that is my critique about it. For example, I've talked about the NGOs pursuing the project of democracy, and here I picked up on research, current research being done about it, that this is a deep politicized project. NGOs, when they go out and try to do something about democracy, they remain far from engagement with the masses, which is the main thrust of any political activity. And education, a monovisual approach, the way the state has followed this approach, whereby on and on they continue to move from an ideological perspective. They tend to scientize religion, and they tend to spiritualize science in a way. This is the modern middle class, and is essentially the elite in Pakistan, the educated elite. HEC, I have criticized in a big way, because on top of the hierarchy of the educational institutions, this particular institution is not serving the nation the way it should as a modernizing society. Of course, all this happens in the name of the society itself, but there is jump back to history more than a move forward into the future. And in this context, I discuss the textbooks, which I consider have been a pedagogical disaster. Of course, all textbooks represent an ideological subtext, but beyond that, today's textbook must prepare the students for the larger role for the society in terms of understanding one's own society and other societies, and positioning oneself in the 21st century in a productive way. And I've discussed the media. This is now in another framework, that is the control of the state over the media, and how media has not been able to perform its function properly. And I've then discussed a whole series of the state's actions which lead to controlling the media, particularly from the perspective of not letting the bad governance go to the people as a message. And this has been, of course, a development which is there, common with most of the other countries who are not mature democracies. And finally, my theme is the outsider. Here, I tried to see in which way the outsider is not only outsider as group, in terms of not participating in the ideological and other kinds of resources of the situation. I think that there has been an ideologization of knowledge itself. And I've quoted from Merton for that there is the insider truth and there is the outsider truth. Whatever is seen outside through the media and on the ground, there are two versions. One, the version of the insiders, the mainstream, those who claim or rather own the state. And on the other hand, there are those who look at the same reality from the perspective of the outsider. So first and foremost is the problem of understanding politics itself. If you try to understand it from the other non-traditional perspective, then you come to know that there is something called the outsider. And here, yes, I've got, I think, 2 minutes more. I've talked about Bengali and Sindhis and Pashtuns and the Baloch, and of course there are subgroups like Saraiki and Hazaras of Pashtun area, the ethnic outsiders. And there are minority outsiders, Christians, Hindus, Ahmadis, Sikhs, and others. And these are the people who are the unimagined citizens of Pakistan. They are there, but they are not part and parcel of the mind of the society at large, and they are virtually unrepresented in the political system. Of course, I've talked about the sectarian outsiders as well, Shias, Hazaras, and others. So there has been a practice of the state to keep the outsiders inside. In other words, the state has been compromising, always belatedly, but still. It has been doing the damage control. And I've given the examples, example of separation of Karachi from Sindh, 1948, and of course Bengali as a national language. Their status was denied, then granted. One unit put in place, destroying the federalist formula at the level of West Pakistan, and then withdrawing it. Presidentialism put in place and then withdrawing it. And of course, the quota system, which it will not withdraw, even though it's hurting the insider community of Muhajirs, but it was considered non-political to do so. And of course, repatriation of Bihari, again, the demand of the insiders, but it will not help to keep the state stable. And therefore, I would lastly mention that there will still remain those which were considered not to be able to enjoy that position, that is keeping the outsider outside. And there, the Baloch among the ethnic groups and the Ahmadis among the religious groups, I would say these have been the two groups which do not find their space in the society and in the state. And I've also mentioned here and there the census controversy, which in a way defines these problems of alienation. Thank you very much, and I hope I'll be able to answer if there are questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Waseem, for this sample of a very, very detailed and rich book. And I hope it has given some desire for the audience to go more deeply into it. We will now turn to Farzana, who will focus more on the historical dimension of the book that is in the first chapters. And Farzana, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Gustav. I'd like to start, of course, by thanking the King's India Institute and Dr. Louise Tillin for inviting me today to discuss this new book by Professor Waseem on political conflict in Pakistan. And of course, it's a pleasure here to be in conversation with the author and my very distinguished panelists, Christophe, Jafrelo, and Aisha Siddiqa. So let me begin by saying that as one who has formally endorsed Professor Waseem's book, I hope you will forgive me if I reiterate my opinion of this work as a unique achievement. This is not only because of the depth and the reach of its analysis or the author's command over a dizzying range of sources that carry all the hallmarks of a classic. It is also because it is so remarkably free of the platitudes, the hand-wringing, and dare I say, denial of uncomfortable truths that have tended to mar the work on Pakistan, even by its most talented scholars. For a study informed by the discipline of political science, it is also refreshingly denuded of jargon without losing any of the sophistication of its conceptual apparatus. Some of its insights into Pakistan, past and present, are certainly arresting, while others unsettle many cozy assumptions that have shaped our understanding of the country. The idea that the governing religious framework embraced by Pakistanis at partition was set to emerge as a challenge to the Pakistani state as a rival source of legitimacy on page 29, merits some reflection. While the idea, Waseem's idea, that equating democracy with Hindu rule in pre-partition India may have infused the Pakistan project with a fear rather than a passion for democracy is certainly troubling. No less disturbing is Waseem's deconstruction of Pakistan's middle classes as natural partners of the authoritarian state, which explodes many of our cherished myths about their inherently progressive credentials. Now, there can be no doubt that this is a serious book, but it is also one, I think, that brings a wry sense of humor, rare among works of this kind. For who could improve on Waseem's witty observation that in 1947, Pakistan got out of India, but India did not get out of Pakistan. Sure, at more than 500 pages, this is a hefty doorstopper of a book. But given its riches, I'm sure most readers will forgive the muscle strain. That said, this doesn't make my job as a discussant any easier. Time constraints mean that I have been forced to choose what to focus on, even at the risk of abbreviating the argument of this book, whose strength, I think, lies precisely in weaving together the myriad strands that bind the complex tapestry of political conflict in Pakistan. Choose I must. So it seemed to me that as a historian of the idea of Pakistan, I would perhaps be best placed to say something about the conflict embedded in Pakistan's founding moments. Those moments and their subsequent trajectory are thoughtfully explored by Waseem in the first two chapters of his book through the prism of what he describes as Pakistan's master narrative, which aims to totalize a plurality of events to give them meaning and make sense of history. That narrative, he argues, is steeped in conflict and has set the parameters of Pakistan's national project. He does, however, concede that it is not the only narrative at play. Rival ethnic and sectarian narratives in Pakistan also compete for space in much the same way as the forces of, quote, an indigenous revival, driven by the idea of a multicultural Pakistan, have challenged the text of a homogeneous cultural landscape written by those in power. Waseem's depiction of Pakistan's master narrative underscores its complex and protean nature. But there are, I think, a number of features that stand out as key to its understanding. The first is what he describes as a civilizational metaphor, which casts Pakistan as an expression of Indo-Islamic civilization, and which served to fashion Pakistan's founding ideology, the two-nation theory, with its presumption of a fundamental difference between Muslims and Hindus that justified the claim to separate Muslim statehood. Another building block in shaping this master narrative was, to use Waseem's words, the construction of the Hindu demon. Its most potent and arguably toxic expression is found today in primary and secondary educational texts, to which, of course, Waseem made reference, that have molded the minds of successive generations of Pakistanis to create a parallel universe known to some as paranoidistan, which is fueled by a conspiratorial mindset and which Waseem argues has now taken root among educated Pakistanis. He uses this schizophrenic frame to illuminate another key facet of Pakistan's master narrative, resting on what he calls an alternative globality that is informed by, quote, a world of Islam perspective. Crafted in response to Pakistan's self-image as a citadel of Islam, it has evolved to become the mainstay of an entrenched dichotomy that pits Islam against the West, with an increasingly powerful hold on Pakistan's perceptions of the world abroad as fundamentally hostile and belligerent. In recent years, Waseem argues, it has gained momentum in the guise of a Thomas Hardy-esque character he identifies as the returning native, whose embrace of a post-colonial scholarly discourse has led to privileging religious over other frameworks as a corrective to Western thinking. By doing so, Waseem contends, it has deepened the polarity between Islam and the West, upon which Pakistan's master narrative has drawn for sustenance. It comes as no surprise, therefore, in light of these reflections, that Waseem should conclude that, quote, the issue of religion, namely Islam, at the heart of Pakistan's master narrative has been one of unending contestation between modernists and traditionalists. The question is why? And the answer, I believe, and as I have argued elsewhere, lies in rival meanings attached to the terms of Islam and the enduring struggle to exercise a political monopoly over the expression of Islam in shaping the profile of Pakistan. Nowhere did this conflict exact a heavier toll than in the protracted competition between a largely Western-educated political leadership of self-styled Muslim modernists dedicated to the idea of Pakistan as a modern Muslim democracy, and a formidable coalition of Islamists representing the clerical establishment and Muslim traditionalists who sought the creation of a state bound by the enforcement of Islamic law in Pakistan. Yet, the division between the two sides came ultimately to rest not so much on their diverging interpretations of Islam, which was to be expected, but on the right of each side to interpret what was signified by Islam. A political struggle that hinged, ironically, on the demonstration of Islamic credentials. It has resulted in the extraordinary spectacle of a largely Western-educated governing elite, which has been forced to compensate for its historic lack of political legitimacy and Islamic expertise by making ever more extravagant claims of acting, quote, in the name of Islam, while being held to account by an increasingly combative clerical establishment and its allies, who are determined to test the Islamicity of a state that professes to privilege Islam and its followers. That partition's most enduring legacy for Pakistan should come to rest upon contestation over the terms of Islam is largely a consequence of what I would call Pakistan's consensus problem, which has precluded a meaningful discourse architecture to account for the state's historical purpose. It was compounded by the uncertain contours of Pakistan's historical, territorial, and linguistic imagination, which Waseem casts as forms of agnosticism, which intensified the potential for conflict and which, I would argue, serve as the turbulent backdrop of Pakistan's ambiguous relationship to Islam. Those ambiguities surfaced almost immediately upon the creation of the state, with the business of constitution making an early casualty. Since its inception, Pakistan has had 3 constitutions, and all without exception have been and continue to be mired in controversy over their Islamic texture. They also expose the depth of uncertainty and indeed agnosticism about the place of Islam in the definition of Pakistan's identity, and an uncertainty that was historically grounded in tensions between the visions of a moral community defined by a commitment to the normative prescriptions of Islam and the idea of a nation defined by the relationship of citizens to the state. One of the most significant byproducts of this lack of clarity has been the fabrication of an identity predicated on opposition to India. Its implications have been far-reaching for Pakistan, and where its translation into outright rivalry and hostility to India has enabled the military to emerge as a key arbiter of the country's national interest and identity. However, the nebulous association between Islam and the state in Pakistan has been most acutely felt in questions over political belonging. Competing discourses over Islam have accentuated the unstable and uncertain relationship between being Muslim and being Pakistani, an uncertainty which has claimed an exceptionally heavy price from Pakistan's religious minorities. We have also, of course, weakened pluralist definitions of the Pakistani and compromised a broader pluralist vision of Pakistan. As a state self-consciously founded on the separation of Muslims from non-Muslims, Pakistan's dilemmas, I believe, will remain acute so long as the attachment to Muslim nationalism is politically licensed to constrain the expansion of a more inclusive Pakistani identity. Although his defenders have regularly looked to the legacy of Jinnah, and especially his appeal on 11th August 1947, which called for all members of his new state, whatever their religion, creed, or caste, to be judged as equal citizens, it has been difficult in practice to dismantle the divisive rhetoric upon which Jinnah built his career as the sole spokesman of Muslims and the bearer of the two-nation theory. Nor indeed has it been easy to address the implications of Jinnah's well-worn ambivalence about the role of Islam in settling the issue of Pakistan's constitutional identity. Such is the hold of his commanding authority that any close public scrutiny of Jinnah's conflicting statements on Islam is still seen as an act of lèse-majesté. In more ways than one, therefore, the ambiguities of Pakistan's founding moments continue to resonate. The failure of Jinnah and his political successors to squarely confront the question of reconciling a state consciously founded on a religious claim to nationalism, with modern notions of democracy and the equal rights of citizens, promises to leave a lasting imprint. While there have been efforts, of course, at times to ease these contradictions by positing Pakistan as, quote, a homeland for Muslims and differentiating it from an Islamic state, it is, I think, hard to avoid thinking that this distinction amounts to anything more than a rhetorical flourish. All this might suggest that Pakistan was in trouble from the start. The double burden of navigating the multiple agnosticisms outlined by Waseem that suffuse its national discourse, while still struggling 70 years after partition to establish, quote, the right kind of Islam for Pakistan, raises some questions about whether we can, as Waseem suggests, meaningfully treat Pakistan's political conflicts as typical of the post-colonial state, or whether we must reopen the thorny question of Pakistani exceptionalism. Yet, in conclusion, I would like to believe that Pakistan's capacity to develop a more cohesive national life that can be remodeled to adapt its fault lines are far from exhausted. But doing so will depend not on pursuing or seeking to impose a stricter consensus under the aegis of the authoritarian state in Pakistan and its offspring, referred to by Waseem as an establishmentarian democracy, but by recognizing that the multiple meanings attached to such consensus can serve as the basis of a more harmonious and inclusive society. I'll just leave it there.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Razana, for bringing this historical perspective that is there in the book by Professor Waseem, but that you enriched so much and problematized also. This relation to India is so important, and we may return to that in the discussion, but I see now India converging so much towards Pakistan. There is certainly something there that we'll have to discuss. Thank you very much. And I turn now to Ayesha, who will also present facets of the book by using her own expertise. Ayesha, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Christophe. And I joined Farzana in thanking Dr. Tillen and King's College India Institute for inviting me to speak about this very important book. I must say, I bow my head in respect to Dr. Waseem. I'm a generation that had learned from his work, and he's given me another opportunity not just to learn, but to thank him for producing such intense and powerful work, which helps me at least understand in my own work, where are we headed in relation to, where is Pakistan headed in relation to military and democratic politics. I would also like to pick up on where Farzana left about, looking at hope or feeling hopeful about where Pakistan's capacity to learn. And I would then, with that question or with that statement, dig into Dr. Waseem's work, especially where he discusses establishmentarian democracy. That is the name he has given to Pakistan's democracy, which is so mired and in some ways so much a creation of the military itself. It also reminds me of his first earlier work, in which he talked about the impact of state institution or the impact of the creation or the nature of the state on Pakistan's politics. Very clearly, this establishmentarian democracy, as Waseem explains, is also about because of how Pakistan's politics is created. Although he doesn't mention a leftist model, but what we see is a military hegemony a la Antonio Gramsci. So the influence is in politics, it's in economy, something which is close to my heart and I worked on, but also on shaping the narrative regarding politics. And this is a clutch from which political parties have not managed to extract themselves. Dr. Waseem uses a very interesting concept of the influence of military metaphysics, which he borrows from Wright Mills. And basically, the narrative, military metaphysics is the narrative which has been created by the military to judge politics, political parties, influence the behavior of the society. And I think that is a very exciting concept because it also then helps us understand why Pakistani politics has not managed to carve a space for itself and get out of the influence of this establishmentarian democracy. I mean, there are parties, and the reason that when we read the book, we see is that the whole system of politics itself is so much created by a bureaucratic state, which is how it evolves. The state bureaucracy, the civil bureaucracy, which is also in politics. I mean, it's interesting that out of the first 9 prime ministers that you see from 47 to 58, half of them are bureaucrats who are setting and giving shape to not just politics, but its foreign policy. And that's where, and that's a clutch from which political parties have not gotten out. So very meticulously, Dr. Waseem has looked at political parties, their shaping, their connection with state bureaucracy, starting from 47 till 2021. And, so from Muslim League, from Muslim League to Pakistan Muslim League and its different kind of forms and shapes, PMLQ and PMLN and different other and shapes of Muslim League, to People's Party, and then PTI, Tehreek-e-Insaf, ANP, MQM. All these parties are discussed in this chapter. But what I think is very interesting as we read this analysis is to see how political parties have consistently failed to invest in institution building themselves. And perhaps one of the reasons is that they're so influenced by the narrative which has been shaped by the military, which on the one hand is connected with religion or the use of Islam as primary identity of the state. Yet, on the other, it kind of looks at military as, or presents the military as someone is an institution that protects not just against the outside enemy, but also the inside enemy. And that inside enemy, I mean, it's so interesting that consistently and historically, political parties, despite their understanding that they are fighting a battle against the military, have been unable to free themselves and produce an alternative narrative which challenges the fact that political institutions or political parties are being referred to as entities that threaten the state. Politicians are, cannot be depended upon. They're corrupt, they're dishonest, they're a threat to the state and society. I mean, that is the primary projection of politics. And military metaphysics, as Waseem argues, is very much critical in producing this kind of an understanding. But I think what is also, I mean, the argument which I find very exciting is also Waseem's approach to the middle class, and how middle class has consistently been a partner of the authoritarian military instead of the political forces and the political classes. I think it's a very exciting argument. Now, he uses history in his book. He uses history to draw out and also to describe how the middle class has evolved from before partition to after partition. And also reminds me of the argument that one often has. Something which keeps recurring is that the failure in Pakistan's politics is the land-owning feudal class. And yet, when we see this work, very logically, we understand that that class has actually not been there in power. I mean, its power has been consistently challenged. And as far as narrative is concerned, it has been pushed back immensely. So what is the story about middle class, number one? And what is the story about middle class modernizing?
Am I the only one who cannot hear Yesha anymore?
Yeah, I'm just finishing.
Okay, please go ahead.
So sorry. So the point is, I think the basic conclusion, and that is where I think one would want to and sorry, before I finish, I think one of the very important points which Dr. Waseem also makes is questioning that youth itself is the one, or is an element which can bring about a different Pakistan, because it is equally invested in the same kind of ideology and perspective that Pakistan has inherited, and which is very influenced by militarist thinking. So no new institutions get to be made, no institutional pushback comes, and no alternative thinking is there. And so what we have is a very hegemonic perspective. And then which makes me, I'm interested in asking this question, that how do you then deviate? Where is the shift, or where is the challenge that Dr. Waseem sees there? Because despite what in very recent years, one had seen PMLN, for example, challenging the military or seeming to challenge the military hegemony. But reading through Waseem's work, it is very clear, and rightly so, that there is actually no huge challenge. So how does then one foresee a shift in society if the educated? And one more thing is that, the whole discussion on middle class, one thing which I thought was missing is that the middle class, some of it, which Dr. Waseem has definitely mentioned, the progressive middle class, which is socially progressive, but politically regressive, that is the issue. But then you also have a middle class, which is very conservative as well. And I thought that needed a bit more mention. Now, and one final point is, I think it's important that how military is expanding its influence and power on the back of this middle class. It is encouraging the middle class everywhere, even in smaller provinces, to actually participate in military activities and become part of the military family. I see that increasingly happening in Sindh in particular, where the number of people, numbers that have joined the military have increased. Not just increased, but also made to challenge the traditional power centers. I mean, that's a very interesting evolution that is happening, that we theoretically see explained so well in Dr. Waseem's work. I hope that in the Q&A we get to hear more about this relationship between the middle class and Pakistan's politics.
Thank you very much, Ayesha. And your wish is going to be exhausted, because there are questions indeed about the middle class in the Q&A box. Thank you very much, Ayesha, for highlighting this dimension of Professor Waseem's book. That is, if you want, the sociological dimension or background of the Pakistani political trajectory. So indeed, there is a question, in fact, there are two questions asked by Goralpal Singh, and I will read them out, but you can also find them in the box if you prefer to read it yourself, Professor Waseem. Thank you, Professor Waseem, and to the discussants for a wonderful discussion. Can you say something on, one, how do you distinguish between conflict and violence, and role of the latter in the wrong sizing of the state from 1947 and the pervasiveness of violence inside and on the borders of Pakistan? And two, why should we assume that the middle class in South Asia be progressive when both in India and Pakistan they have readily embraced religious nationalism? Well, the second point, of course, is more in the form of a comment than a question, but you're most welcome to respond to both. So Professor Waseem, and of course other panelists, if they wish, can respond.
Okay, thank you, Gurpal. The difference between conflict and violence, of course, is quite a bit. There is violent conflict, and there is a conflict, for example, within the precincts of parliamentary politics, where there is a definite conflict, or conflict, for example, even religious conflict can be and has been non-violent. And of course, on the other hand, you see militant Islam in Pakistan and elsewhere. So to me, that seems to be the way out, that yes, conflict can be violent or otherwise. Your additional comment was that violence played a role in the way partition took place and whatever. If I understand you correctly, actually I have written in the book that violence came much later. On the 3rd June, they decided about the future of this country, of that country. And then there was a line, the Red Cliff Line, which was not there when the two countries became independent, not even on 15th or 16th August, only on 17th August, or according to Pakistani calendar, 3 days after partition. So that was, in a way, the consequence of partition rather than a factor leading to it. So it was not a maker and shaper of partition itself, although, of course, there was quite a bit of violent activity going on in NWFP at that time and in Punjab. But the problem is that the decision had been taken at another level. And of course, then violence has been studied in the context of Pakistan, amazingly, without touching the real conflict. That means the conflict between the power holders, democratically elected elements, and those who represented the state apparatus. Not violent. There were these 4 coups, or all of them bloodless. In other words, such important developments took place, but not necessarily through violence. Of course, violence has been operative in the context of Taliban in Pakistan a decade ago or earlier than that. So yes, your own study of violence in the context of partition, to which I referred. Of course, there has been a lot of violence, particularly at the personal level. Rape, that was one violence, and arson and whatever. So I would say, yes, I understand what you mean, and I'm very much with you on the question of violent expression of the conflict here and there. Yes.
Thank you. Thank you. More questions are coming. Fazana and Ayesha, you just tell me if you want to add anything whenever that arises. So 2 more questions are asked by Kiran Hassan first. Brilliant work by Professor Waseem. Can you expand more on the systematic oppression of Pakistani media? And do you perceive any shift with the privatization of media in 2002? And then we'll turn to Asma's questions.
Okay. The media, in fact, in the beginning, it was questioned under Musharraf, if I remember, why did he open up the media channel, a dozen channels so at that time, and then more? Did it make him a liberal sort of ruler? Because in certain other ways, with 2 puppies on the side, he tried to make a profile of himself as a liberal, particularly after Zia's image abroad, whichever it was. So the information minister at that time, Javed Jabbar, interpreted the move and in fact championed it, that there are so many Indian channels throwing the messages all over the world and therefore gaining politically, and somehow he was able to convince the military ruler at that time. And of course, there must be an opinion bloc within the army that we now have to use media, at least in the form of multiple channels for spreading the official message. So there was this idea at that time. In the beginning, if you remember 2007 lawyers movement, this was particularly put to test. Now, what is the military dictator going to do? Because the Chaudhry Iftikhar's procession from town to town, city to city, covered live by the media channels, that was really something which Musharraf had never expected, and the establishment in general was not very much approving it all. So from that time onwards, there was more consciousness of the media control. Under Zardari and under any PPP government, there is the absence of an image of strength, because they are there despite the establishment and never with the approval of establishment. The PPP governments in succession were weak governments. They tried to prolong their days in office and not confronting the establishment. Of course, here and there, we can pick up the cases like the bill which was very passed in the Congress, in the US Congress, about aid. But otherwise, those were the years when media was not particularly on the wrong side of the government in terms of control. Under Nawaz Sharif, of course, then PICA 2016, that was the first major anti-media legislation. And now recently, Imran Khan has added a few nails of his own and issued a presidential ordinance. So what I wanted to say is that, yes, media control has been there. Under Ayub, it reached its height, and even before and after. And under Nawaz Sharif and Imran Khan, now the media is considered to be a matter of life and death. Control the communication to the masses at large. That is one way of control as part of the political system. It's a control mechanism. It's control of the public opinion. And somehow social media is still functioning to the detriment of Imran Khan's government. So I would say, yes, there is a fully fledged program of control of the media in Pakistan. Yes?
Thank you. Ayesha is about to add something on this front.
Yes.
Yeah. I think, military's influence in media has always been there. It's not new, as Dr. Waseem mentioned, from the times of Ayub Khan onwards. But I think it became much more structural after 2007 when media expanded. In fact, media was allowed to expand, and that's not news to anyone who's listening to this conversation. 2007 onwards, the understanding was that you expand the media and then you control the narrative. You use it to control the narrative. That's the basic thing. But I think one also needs to bracket two institutions, media and academia. The manner in which, and both are seen actually as a way to generate the narrative which influences the mind of those of opinion makers. So the middle class, the opinion makers, and general masses. To quote a senior military official in Karachi, whose argument was that the military institution has to protect the defense and the Bahriyas and these elite housing schemes, because this is where the middle class lives. And this is the middle class which runs Pakistan. So in that same context, media's control has been used, and academia as well. Look at how General Bajwa is going around universities, visiting universities and lecturing. What is underlying thing in that? The idea that you have to control those people who make opinion. This is a recruiting drive, which is essential for the military.
Certainly, I would agree, yes.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Ayesha. Asma asked two questions now. The concept of alternative globalities, in quotation marks, is fascinating in your book. Can you elaborate this further? Today, we see Russia developing an alternative globality following the Ukraine issue. So would this concept be stretchable to various domains and regions? And secondly, about the outsiders, do outsiders potentially become insiders? What shapes this trajectory and transformation if and when it does happen?
Of course, I borrowed the concept of alternative globalities from Ritz, from Germany, and it looked fascinating to me. Pakistanis have been operating in the world of Islam perspective, and they often, at least potentially, made their exit from the world at large and taken refuge in the world of Islam, tried their best to make OIC more relevant than it is. It is unfortunate for them that it never took off. So the intellectual globality framework is there, and it comes into operation, for example, on the question of Palestine every now and then, on the question of Islamic militancy, Islamophobia. Whenever something happens somewhere, by way of a crime or otherwise. Very many countries, they joined hands. Back then in 1980s, it was Salman Rushdie's book that again created a joint response, and so on. So I tried to distinguish the world of Islam from the world of Hinduism, for example. There is no world of Hinduism as such. 3 countries, or rather 2.5 countries, India, Nepal, and the island, Hindu island in Muslim Indonesia, or Christian world, there isn't any. Ethiopia, England, and America and France don't make one block that way. So yes, this is very useful. But I find it interesting, the second part of the question. I didn't think along those lines. Russia's alternative globality. It tried to play in the existing globality, tried to, and made long strides from Yeltsin onwards to move into the Western financial world and even democratic world and so on. And during the last decade or so, in a way, it has been withdrawing. And that particular halcyon period when there was a Soviet Empire, probably that's a haunting sort of framework of thinking there. But more than that, it was strategic. I believe that NATO's coming close to the borders, in a way, propelled that particular feeling of insecurity, or try to stop the expansionism of Moscow. So yes, I wish I had, I wish that I take it up sometimes. Russia's alternative globality, we'll see. And I think we can do away with the second part.
Yes, yes. Now there is one question by Yunus Samad. I was wondering about path dependency. Do we see no possibility of social political change without a critical juncture? There is no evolutionary path to a democratic and inclusive Pakistan.
So there, probably I'll relate it to the second part of Asma.
Sorry, Farzana was raising her hands. Do you want to add something on the previous point, Farzana?
Yes, actually I did, but
Sorry.
I'm quite happy for Waseem to pick up Yunus Samad's question first.
Yes,
Okay,
yes,
okay,
yes.
all right.
So there is the path dependence. It can, for example, picking up from the previous question, can the outsiders become insiders? And there I should remember the Pashtun population, Pashtun middle class particularly, but also the lower down, the elements there. The more Pashtuns entered the state, by way of, for example, the first 4 commanders-in-chief of the army being Muslim, being Pathan, one way or the other, the more I fear the Muhajirs were moving out, not by choice. Pashtuns one step in, and Muhajirs felt that they were pushed outside a bit here and there, one step out, and their path dependence. Will this situation change? I understand it that way, this particular question. So yes, I believe, without being cynical, without being pessimistic about it, yes, a very significant event, intellectual or otherwise, will change the matters. Otherwise, rigmarole, I see a kind of a vicious circle. For example, 1971 debacle in Dhaka, it did take away the predominant role of army for some years, for some purposes, but then again, back to the routine. So right now, the comfort zone of the establishment can be seen out there. I mentioned yesterday, actually, in Karachi Literary Festival, I used the word that this no confidence vote, this is from the establishment through the no confidence to the establishment, meaning that the system remains the same. So, Yunus, I think this is a situation. The classes are very much dug in. The subalterns are out of action. Nothing out there. There is a kind of an understanding of mutual interests between the two power centers, and therefore all remains well. Yes.
Thank you, Farzana.
Yes.
Yes,
I was
madam.
just, can you hear me? Yes, I have unmuted myself. I was just going to respond to that very interesting question from Asma, and to pick up on this this notion of alternative globality. And while I was reading Waseem's sort of explanation of its importance, his description of its importance, I was led to ask myself really two questions. The first was whether or not Pakistan, given its founding ideology and some of the issues that I raised in my presentation, whether Pakistan was more vulnerable to this so-called alternative globality and the world of Islam perspective, for the simple reason that I do believe there remains as yet an unresolved question about whether Pakistan is to conduct itself as a nation state or an Islamic movement. I mean, we still have to this day that tussle between those who would want Pakistan to take its place in the community of nations and those who would argue that Pakistan was ultimately an ideological state. And I think that debate has not yet been settled. But the other aspect to this also comes from the feeling that perhaps we need to see this idea of the world of Islam perspective as coming in the wake of a time when there is now a great and growing, what I would call, political economy of religious offense and Islamophobia, where religious offense has come to assume a status such as to redefine almost what it means to be a Muslim. In other words, what I'm trying to say is that in the prevailing circumstances of, a worldwide discourse or a global discourse of Islamophobia, somehow not taking offense at what is judged to be an act of blasphemy or religious offense is somehow deemed to make one less of a Muslim. I mean, we are seeing a certain transformation in what it means to be a Muslim. A Muslim now is one who is within, of course, the context of this political economy, is one who is outraged and naturally enraged by acts of blasphemy. And I think this is what has made Pakistan more vulnerable to the kind of so-called world of Islamic perspective that that Waseem lays out in his book.
May I?
Thank you, Vadana.
Yeah, okay, yes.
I would say that on the other side, the Hindus are more or less following the same trajectory and more define themselves by their capacity to be outraged similarly, in spite of Hinduism not being a transnational religion by contrast to Islam.
No, but they don't have the global reach of Islam. Hinduism still remains, for all practical purposes, tied to a national discourse.
Yeah, this is the big difference. Even though sometimes you wonder, the diaspora plays such a huge role in this transformation of Hinduism. You may now need to define Hinduism as a transnational religion as well, with North American variants and British variants influencing the Hindus of India. But I don't want to hijack the conversation, and we may stay in Pakistan, and I may add one last question. We have 2 minutes left, and I may repeat a question I asked yesterday, Professor Waseem, if you don't mind, because you had no time to respond to this question, and the Karachi Literary Festival is much more a tamasha kind of thing. We are in between academics today, so we can afford to think more. Now, yesterday I asked the question about, is the fact that Imran Khan and the establishment seem to be on the same page and may remain on the same page for one full term, which is unprecedented, does it suggest that a new kind of establishmentarian democracy is taking shape? Because if we go back to your table, page 230, a remarkable summary of the political trajectory of Pakistan, it does not fit anywhere. The present dispensation does not fit anywhere. So do we see a new model in the making? And is it sustainable? Or will the establishment get rid of Imran Khan the way they had got rid of the others? Which is not a contradiction in terms.
Yes. I frankly don't see that there is any, sorry, my telephone disturbed me. Yes, establishment is in control. And establishment learns and has learned to deal with its proteges, directly speaking, those who were ensconced in the position by itself, that is by establishment, or those who somehow got away from the script. So in 2008 and 2013, the things slipped out of the hands. But then soon establishment was there as a major actor, the actor in the final sense. So in this case, again, a protege getting stronger, too big for his boots. This is the impression of genders usually. And there, what do they do? It's very difficult right now, because Najam Sethi and others, quite a few of them who comment on the situation constantly, they have made certain predictions. Yes, there's the time to go. He's gone, he's already gone, etc. He's lost the game. On the other hand, it's still in balance. Who is going to win? The 2 days I spent in Karachi Literary Festival, everybody was asking, so is he in or is he out? Very difficult to say, because right now it's a kind of a number of, it's a game of numbers, and that's it. Out there in the society, there isn't a major anti-Imran sort of bursting out. No, everybody knows, yes, he's close to the establishment. They may be very unhappy, but the street is not there this time, neither with the opposition, particularly with PMLN, rather difficult, nor with Imran, because a bit of street which he never had the national street, by the way. It was only the drama in Islamabad, the nerve center of politics, and that was it. So in the end, he made it by other means. Therefore, street power not being there, probably the initiative will remain in the hands of the establishment, even if the no confidence vote succeeds.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And I would really urge everybody to go to this book and read it and put it on the list of readings for students, because this is a very, very rich and very, I would say, timely book that Professor Waseem has just published. By the way, Professor Waseem, will there be any South Asia edition?
I did talk to
Michael Dwyer.
Michael Dwyer. He said, okay, if the book sells the way it's selling, we'll bring a paperback edition.
Paperback edition.
Yeah, but again, Michael.
Okay. Well, now books travels anyway. Thank you, everybody. Thank you all. And have a good evening or afternoon if you are on that side of the world.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Christoph.
Very nice. Thank you. Christoph, it was beautiful. Thank you, Aisha. Thank you, Rana. Amazing. What a pleasure.
Many congratulations again, Waseem.
Yeah, sure.
Thank you. Hello.
Thank you.
Vinesh.
Bye-bye.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor. Yeah. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Yeah. Bye.
Bye.